Before we get into our study, I want to encourage you to go ahead and get ready by opening up your Bibles to your Old Testament. We're going to be looking at, wait for it, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. No, we're not going to look at them in detail, but that certainly is the text that will be in the background as we talk about the rebuilding of Jerusalem from the standpoint of history and geography. Before we get into our study, though, let's take a moment and bow our heads together in prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for today and the blessings that we share in Christ. We thank you for the connections that are tying us together as disciples and followers of Jesus. Help us this morning to be good students, to be attentive to your scriptures, and to discern your word in a way that builds our faith and helps us become more like your Son and more in line with your goals for us. Please forgive us of our sins, and we offer this prayer in your Son's name. Amen. All right, as mentioned, we are looking at the next building block of the biblical story. What we're doing is continuing this process of following through the historical timeline of God's people and God's creation. We had already covered, for those who are visiting with us, just to kind of catch things most recently, both of the falls of the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, as well as the rise of the Persian Empire and the preparation for captivity. We closed off last week looking a little bit into detail as to the context of that captive environment where God was fulfilling a couple of concepts and promises. Promise number one was their captivity and the length of it. Promise number two is their return. And so these have started to have the girding or the structure underneath it to allow God's people to come back from their combined captivity. If you remember from our study of those events, they entered into captivity in three kind of steps, where there are three gatherings together of the people of Israel to go into captivity. That'll be important because when we talk about the return, there are three groups that come back. And so it's a great way to remember these sequence events. 3 steps they go in, 3 steps they come out. From that captive place, we're going to try to make sure we make note of some of the things that seem to have changed about these people. The people who go into captivity and the people who come out are fundamentally shifted off the standard, if you will, of what we expect them to be. Because I'll ask you this question. From your reading of the Old Testament, Genesis to the captive experiences, that's in the Middle Prophets, did Israel struggle with idolatry? Absolutely. So much so that we have to be very careful in sorting out the details in their religious practices. Because the Bible will clearly indicate that large portions of Israel at times were essentially idolatrous pagans. But they'll still call them Israel, but their religious practice had changed. When they come out of captivity, some forms of idolatry seem to have diminished in them. Idolatry still exists. They still struggle to truly follow the living God. But some forms of idolatry seem to have been pushed to the wayside. In particular, the practical observance of the pagan religions of the Canaans seem to mostly be gone post-captivity. Further, for Israel in particular, not the other communities that are sprinkled into Israel post-captivity, the kind of idolatry they struggle with moves away from building statues, building monuments, and considering them their God. Instead, they struggle with making the things that God had them build their idol. So there's a shift in the kind of idolatry. It's not that idolatry has gone away, but the kind has changed. And there's a shift in the focus of their communal religious practice. There's a segment or two of them that are highly devoted to God, sometimes so excessively devoted that they lose sight of the principles of the Scriptures. There's a large chunk in the middle, and then there are compromisers on the other end. Now, that also should make you think about how it's always been and how it always will be. That's kind of how it is. But it becomes in clearer focus the close of the captivity and the rise of Christ. And much of our understanding of that comes from the way in which Christ deals with them after his maturity in the flesh. Once he begins to preach, we see some of these things very clearly in that regard. So let's talk a little bit then about the history on the rebuilding of Jerusalem. Now note, when we're doing this overview in this historical sense, we're not getting into the weeds, the details of the various biblical texts and some of the interactions. Some of them, though, are substantially valuable to us because they represent ideas or principles that tie into the history. But what we have here is a shift of things. They go into captivity ashamed. What are some of the ways the Bible describes Israel and Judah as they go into captivity? Yeah, it uses a phrase stating their nakedness is exposed. And there's a couple of tones to that phrase that are important to catch. Number one is this is designed to depict them in the most shameful of ways. There's nothing positive about this. Further, in exposing their nakedness, the terminology there is not solely saying they have no clothes on. There are terms that do use that sometimes, but it's intended to teach us at least two things about this. In the Old Law, particularly in the text of Leviticus, is there any term that you recall, by the way, pro tip there is, about uncovering someone's nakedness? The phrase that's familiar from the law of Leviticus? You don't have to get into details, but what's the context of that phrase? Is it a positive or a negative thing? Negative thing. In fact, it indicates some form of illicit physical activity. You're doing something between you and another being that you should not be doing. And it's categorized as sometimes inside the family, or sometimes you can't do it outside of marital spaces. Those are the way that phrase is used. That's a shameful thing. This is where he's going to tie this idea of being uncovered nakedness for Israel. How did God describe his feeling towards the spiritual rebellion of Israel and Judah when they followed after the false gods? What did he say they had done? They had committed adultery, right? This is the terminology that's being... You basically violated the core essence of our covenant and our relationship. In more modern parlance, going up to around the 50s and 60s, you cheated on me. So here's the tie-in. When God's prophets say concerning Israel going into captivity, the first layer of the text is, yes, their shame has been exposed. It's very possible they are without clothing. But the meaning of the message indicates your spiritual infidelity is now known to everybody. You are wearing, in all the various metaphors above the physical, the clear indication that you are not faithful to me. That's that connection that's being drawn there. And that's really important for us to understand why it is that God then deals with them this way. Because there are other prophets that tell us how God handles an unfaithful spouse. Is there a prophet that deals with the story of the unfaithful spouse? Starts with the letter H. Includes somebody else that's not Gomer Pyle, but really similar. Right? Hosea. There's a level of commitment that God has that supersedes their infidelity. So yes, they're going into punishment. Yes, they're going into captivity. Yes, their infidelity has been exposed. Yes, every ounce of the way we think of all those edges for the shame are being played out, but God will call them back. God will reclaim them. God will bring them from their captivity into freedom, and he does so in ways that are often incredibly surprising. Because they go through the crisp, strong hand of you're now crushed into your box. So now being, you're set free. No fanfare. No big army comes in to free them. It's by request. By a prophesied existence. These two segments who are scattered throughout the various edges of these empires because of their rebellion are now permitted to go back to their ancestral lands. It's in the large umbrella of larger spaces, but the Persian Empire is doing something that is counter to what had been done. In the past, the Persian Empire, the Babylonian Empire had been all about making mockery of their slaves and captives. The kings and rulers of the captive people were kept in the capital as living trophies. Free to move around to a degree, but so disconnected from their power base and their support that they were completely incapable of doing other than whatever they were told. And God then continues through his plans and continues through his path and sets them free. A number of these Israelites never even come home. When we think about the return, it's not every Israelite who is living returns to Israel. That's pretty obvious when we consider the outcome of parts of the New Testament, right? So this is like staging the future when we're thinking about the history. Paul, we know a little bit about his background, right? According to the New Testament, what is the short story of the life of Paul? Where was he from? Citizenship? Roman. What maybe community we're thinking about? Saul of Tarsus, right? His Roman citizenship is not by money, it's by birth. So however that happened, and we don't know all the details, he himself is by the standard of Roman law a natural-born Roman. Not a slave set free, not a purchaser because of great wealth, not even one who served in the military in order to earn his citizenship, which was an option, and a large chunk of Roman citizens came from that corner. No, his citizenship was as legit as possible, but not born in Jerusalem. He does get education there. He moves there. He went there to go to college. It's not exactly the same thing, but you can think about it in the terminology that way. So he moves there in that regard and gets his education there. But then when we think about Paul's work, once Paul removes himself from Jerusalem, according to the scriptures, what is his I'm new in town behavior? Paul just gets to town and he says, well, I just got off the boat. What's the first thing he does? He goes to a synagogue or a place to pray. You got two main options. If you can't find one, he goes to the other. If neither of those are there, he goes to the third option, which is finding a place where people are talking about everything and spiritual things. So Paul is able to go to synagogues that only exist because of the captivity. Because prior to this imprisonment in the other nations, there were no large Israelite communities outside of Palestine. They just didn't exist. This is the counterpart to this principle. Has anyone ever told you that the gospel spread so fast because of Roman roads? You ever heard that before? It's something you hear sometimes. Oh, the Roman infrastructure, it made it so easy for everyone to get around. Logistically, it sounds great. And out of your mouth, it sounds awesome. It makes sense. And it's like we were just talking this morning that now because of the internet, we know everything is happening way too soon, right? We know all that stuff. I would argue that that's not necessarily something that we can prove, even though it might be true. But I can prove, both from history and the Bible, The gospel had early access to these communities because there were already followers of God living in those communities. And wherever Paul went, the nearly consistent outcome is that some of them believed. A portion of the synagogues heard Paul reason from the scriptures or others and said, you know what? That sounds pretty good. Seems to match up what we've been looking for. You're telling me that a Messiah came and I wasn't there to see it? Paul would have to say in essence, yep, that's what I'm telling you. And then they would choose. It's a short version, right? We've compressed a whole lot of Bible story into a few paragraphs. And now you have a combination of ideas where, yeah, on the one hand, the Roman road theory makes some sense, but the synagogues, prepositioned by the circumstances that God orchestrated, seems to create lighthouses for people seeking God to go find safety and information. And those same synagogues will become valuable parts of the Bible story in the book of Acts and going forward. And even further, when we look into the letters, and even further in the various events after the destruction of Jerusalem. Those same communities became mixed communities of God-fearing Jews and Christ-seeking disciples, especially as we go through history even further afterwards. So around 536 BCE, we find, by the time we're getting to this return, 50,000 Jews gather together to make this return to Jerusalem. We talked about this last week. We'll talk about it again. It's a very uncommon thing in the history of the world for displaced peoples to return to their ancestral lands and to do so with permission in this way. If you go back through human history, it's an uncommon experience. Because like most of us, our ancestors moved somewhere and then we stayed there. I will suggest, though, that in the coming generations, with mobility of travel and various aspects, it's not going to be the same way anymore. There are friends and brethren I know who live in Stop, Kentucky, as an example, who have never left their county. They were born there, they were raised there, they went to school there, they worked there. And one of them I know whose life is slowly ending into his graying years will be buried there. That will become less and less common in at least American context for the next few generations. This is kind of parallel to things that also happened because it wasn't just Israel that was set free in this regard. Many of the other nations were given the same expectation. But in the case of Israel, what is unique to them is they didn't have to get back any idolatrous artifacts. Their gods weren't given back to them. Here's your statue from your god. Instead, they had a number of the vessels from the temple that were held in any number of ways by the conquering nations. How many of you have ever been to a major museum of antiquities in either the U.S. or overseas? Have you ever been to a big museum where they've got big rock statues and stuff from country A, B, or C? Shirley's been there. I've been there. If you go to those museums and you see anything in there from the Middle East, from Mesopotamia, from that region, nearly all of that was taken by force. Like all of it. For lots of reasons. And it may not have been taken by force by the nation that received it or the nation that had it. It could have been 2 or 3 nations before that. Because this is a common thing. It's a common thing for one nation to go and gather up all the artifacts from another nation they've conquered and then bring it home with them. How many of you, in going through your ancestors' cabinets and closets when they pass away, find memorabilia from their time in the service at different places? Do you think they bought that at a tourist shop? They did not buy that at a tourist shop. They got it through whatever means took place. And actually, at times, in the current context, some of those things, there's agencies for the U.S. and their nation, they try to repatriate them to the rightful owners. A lot of art that was taken from Europe is slowly returning to the appropriate families who it was taken from by the Axis powers. So that's what's going on here. And the Bible had already told us that they had this. This was brought into captivity. For Israel, though, it gives them a jump start in accomplishing two things. One, it gives them funds. Some of these things have true value. They can use in exchange to get equipment and value. But for Israel's real key concerns, it allows them to more quickly return to worship. Because here's the connector. When the temple was built and when the tabernacle was built, how did they put those things together? How did they build their implements of worship? What was the source for the materials and the skills? Who gave them the materials for their implements of worship? There's two answers to the question, by the way. The Lord gave them the materials, but he gave them through the people who were also inhabiting Egypt. Right? The skills. Who granted the craftsmen the skills to craft those implements of worship? God did, right? Now, they had the skills, the people did the work, but God gave them the ability to do so. The New Testament, or excuse me, the Old Testament text here does not tell us that they regained those skills. And we remember that anyone who had knowledge and skill went into captivity up north if they were young enough and they were considered good enough. Everyone left in the land had no skills. And everyone in the middle was either crushed or dispersed. So having these implements gives them both the materials to rebuild and the core important items of worship they needed. They needed these things to properly approach God in worship at the moment that the temple is rebuilt. So we're kind of thinking about that from this aspect. The Bible then shows also in the story, in Ezra in particular, that they're super happy to go on this journey. How many of you are ready for me to announce that next week we're packing up all of our stuff in a wagon train and we are ready to go follow the Appalachian Trail all the way up into New England, and we're going to do it by foot, camel, and wagon. How many of you guys are ready for that hike? Not even James is ready to go with me. He's like, I'm out. To a certain degree, that's what you're seeing here. That kind of journey. Now, the difference for us is we have air conditioning and we like it, and we have cars and we like them. And maybe if I change the criteria and then we're going to box everything up, it's going to be shipped up on truck and we're going to use our own means of transportation to get up there. We're like, it's not as bad. Still not going with you, but it's not as bad, right? They're all excited about this. So let's ask a couple reasons as why, from a historical standpoint, this would be important to them. We can understand the logical, theological ones. They get to worship God again. But historically wise, this gives them some new freedoms. Freedom of association. They can create their Israelite exclusive experiences again. No longer to be subjugated to the powers of a central city that they're in right now. The sense of freedom is there. Now, it doesn't mean that they're being set free completely. But the power center for this empire, the Medo-Persian Empire, is right where they're at, and they're being slowly allowed to return. But this is what they're returning to. So in absence of the power of Israel, the remaining people of the land, they bubbled up. They began to exert their power. You have a lot of peoples gathered together there. In Palestine, remember this is the antiquity term, not the modern small segment of land term, you had all of the ancestral enemies of Israel present. Samaritans, Edomites, Amorites, and Philistines, and random others, and threads of Egypt, all in that area intermingling and reestablishing power bases. Because some of the reasons why this land was important never went away. It is beyond a doubt, a powerful trade hub. Because to get from the bread baskets of Egypt up into the trees and spice sections of Mesopotamia, you go through this region. You got water on one side and desert on the other. The only travelable land is the King's Highway and the Coastal Highway. That's all you got. So when they're returning from captivity, they're coming to a land here that has them returning to a place that power is different for them. Samaritans now have substantial strongholds. 70 years is a good amount of time. 70 years plus extra for others is an extensive amount of time. And so with that, you now have a push and a pull that's drawing them back to not peace, but conflict. But they may not necessarily know that exactly. It's a pretty rational decision, though, ahead of time. Like, hey, we go back to this land. They're not going to be happy that we're here. But they don't have the internet. They don't get up-to-date news notices of, hey, last week there was a big fire in South Jerusalem, and you're going back there. They don't get constant repetition news like we're used to and accustomed to. They get whatever they're told, whatever worms its way up to where they're at. But, as I said, pretty reasonable for them to understand. So they're going back to an area where conflict is inevitable, but their convictions about the return are pretty stable. God is letting us do this. We trust in our God, and it's going to be okay. That's the leadership level. Does all of Israel consistently have the attitude that everything's going to be okay in the return? No, they get distracted. They build their homes before they build walls in the temple. They figure out different solutions to their immediate problem, and so there's some conflict there internally. But there's going to be 3 returns like this. We have Jews that return under the leadership of Zerubbabel to build the temple. Ezra returns with priests, and Nehemiah returns to build the walls. By the way, if you're going to think about these 3 texts in the Bible, now you have ways to categorize the different roles that each of them take place, and it also maybe informs what you think about what they say and how they speak, because the speakers match the tasks. It all comes together, though, by the return of Nehemiah. So incrementally, stuff is moving forward. It's kind of inching step by step towards a level of completion that will have them able to inhabit the land. And in the process of that, you'll see a couple of events when you read through these texts at various times that talk about their willingness to reconnect and recommit to God. There's the reading of the law. There are return events that have them celebrating the return. There are perspective shifts as each of these steps take place. And so return number 1. This is the largest return, by the way, in the way the text lays them out. The Jews return to Palestine under Zerubbabel's leadership. That's one of those Hebrew words that are easier to say, but not easy to say. Because there's some of those Hebrew words in the earlier parts of the Bible that are neither easy to say nor easier by any standard. So Zerubbabel, we can get out. But they get to work on the temple as soon as they get there. They rebuilt the altar of burnt sacrifice, began their sacrifices, and they celebrated when the foundations of the temple were relaid. And they praised God for his mercy. But there were some present who for one reason or another could remember. I remember what it was like. I want to make a little historical point right here that this is how we all are. There is a point in your personal past where there's something spiritually connected, where you remember it in such a strong way that it's better than the present day. The easiest one is to think about the day of your baptism. The day upon which you were baptized and how you felt can never be repeated. It's possible that it could be superseded logically, that you think this definitely is a better day. Maybe it's when you see someone you love, make that same kind of commitment, maybe other things. But the feelings for that will never be duplicated internally for you. So when these Israelites, these Jews return, relay the foundation, and they go, yeah, man, this is awesome, but it's never going to be. And they're right. It is never going to be. But they focused on the wrong thing. They're focusing on the thing that we also focus on, and this is that first tip of the hat to them developing idolatry in how they see the things that God gives them to use for worship. Because what made the tabernacle, what made the temple, what made the second temple great is not the temple and tabernacle. It's that God dwelt inside of it. He pitched his tent there. And so when they're looking at this, they look at it and go, man, these rocks, they're all lined up right. Because all they are, they're just rocks. But they're not lined up as right as they were when we built it the first time. They didn't build it, but they remember it. But that was not it. They were forgetting that God's presence had left the temple. Now for us, we need to make sure we do not fall into the same box. When you think back to those historical events in your own life where you feel like God was really doing great things in you or the people around you, make sure you key into the right stuff. It wasn't the guy doing the preaching. It wasn't the building where you worshiped. It wasn't the culture that surrounded you. It was God doing great things. And so when you reflect on it, make sure you reflect on the right stuff. Man, God did great things then. And he's about to do great things for them. They just don't see it. Because it is not the temple built by Solomon that Jesus declares his greatness in. It is not the temple built by Solomon that the Son of God manifests himself in the flesh multiple times throughout the story of the Scriptures. Even though I wouldn't argue with them thinking that temple was probably better built and fancier. Especially pre-expansion during the time of Rome. This immediately sparks these other people around them trying to paperwork them to death. Hey, wait a minute. Do you have your permits in order? Hey, Les, do you ever want to build a property in Fayette County ever again? Do you want to work with the city codes there to build a church building?
I don't want to work with them anywhere again.
Les and I have talked about this. Les, how many buildings have you helped congregations put together? Is there a math number there?
There's probably 4 or 5.
Yeah, he's helped as long with others.
Started when I was young and helping my dad do some of the same.
Yeah. So if you worship somewhere in one of these counties around here, there's a high possibility that their family may have been involved in one way or another. Les is like, I'm out. Just not going to do it. In part because of the paperwork, other reasons too. It's a lot of work, a lot of stress. But I want you to think about that feeling, and by the way, you and I deal with that too, whenever we try to do something in the county to get something approved, whether it's paying our taxes or all this stuff. Imagine that is now being weaponized against you when you're legitimately doing what the king of the land said you could do. That's the first level of this conflict. Now, that conflict doesn't stay that level, but the accusation is, well, you're traitors. You're not supposed to be building that here. We know that it was destroyed, and we know for certain you have no right to rebuild it. You can't rebuild that. And they went and checked the records, checked the notes. Oh, yeah, they have the right to do so. They just stopped, right? They never put any more conflict in it. They never tried to stop Israel and Judah from rebuilding Jerusalem, right? The paperwork checked out. Is that what they did? They shifted and went to a more physical conflict. This is what begins the story of people rebuilding the walls and rebuilding the temple and rebuilding their homes in shifts. All right, one of you is going to be on watch to make sure no one comes and tries to kill you while you're doing the thing, and the others are going to be doing the thing. That's a different experience. Not a lot of us necessarily in life, every era, every generation, are going to experience that. But some of us have, and some of us could, where building a thing also means you're building it while watching out for someone who's trying to kill you. There's a human experience thing that generationally that happens some. That's the kind of context that's taking place there. And it's also happening in the weirdness that is the change of power in the region. No king lives forever. No king stays in this position of leadership forever. And while we think, well, it was written in the law, that's a good enough reason that I should still keep it. Nearly every ongoing empire, I say nearly ever because there's possible something I forgot. Nearly every ongoing empire has always included the potential for the rules to change. That's because kings get to do king things. You're the king now. You get to tell us what to do. And even if it seemingly to us countermands an earlier king's explicit command, because some kings don't care about the law at all anyway. By the way, in Israel, some of the kings of Israel ruled as despots, not as anointed kings serving in the role positioned by God. I want to do this, so I will. I want to do this even more, so I'll do this even more.
Joseph is a perfect example of that. He was second in command under the king of Egypt. And then that king died, another king grew up that did not know Joseph.
Yeah. And it didn't matter the good that he had done. Yeah, it was like, well, yeah, Joseph. Keep in mind, when it says they didn't remember, they didn't recall, they didn't concern themselves with what Joseph had done, they knew.
They didn't care.
They didn't care. It didn't matter anymore. Because they had got what they wanted. The kingship, the rule. And in this particular case, they would have gotten all the power. Thinking about Joseph. So this then also has them coming back from the farthest extents of the area where power is coming into play, where might is coming into play, and this whole Medo-Persian empire is shifting its dynamics from Babylonian to Assyrian to Mede to Medo-Persian. This will eventually become the Roman Empire, this power structure. But things will kind of twist around a little bit. You'll have internal conflicts until it solidifies around the time that leads up into Christ. Darius, though, begins to conquer new territories. He's a good administrator. He begins the building of roads, by the way. Thinking about the road structure. Romans perfected it. You might say Darius started it. But he also started a postal system. That's also important for us to think about this. It improves the way in which the Israelites who are displaced can interact. And history shows that they did. There's letters from antiquity where Jews were writing each other. Those letters and types of letters continue all the way into, from the same systems into the Roman Empire. And in that same system, you even find correspondence from kings, secondary kings, underneath the Roman Empire's rule, talking about Christians in the 2nd and 3rd century. I think Les is about to hit the first bell. So we're going to pause right here for a second. We'll continue in this return study next Sunday. We got 5 minutes where we want to do a few of our regular questions that we don't do as often anymore. But now, here's our first big question. In this section of the return, and you can go back farther if you wanted to go to, what do you like or not like? When you're thinking about the story, what are things you grab onto and say, I really like that? Or, my favorite, I don't like that much at all. Well, that's what you got. You got something there.
and you gotta admire their enthusiasm when they started out to rebuild the temple, and when they rebuilt the walls, because they had a sword in one hand and a tool in the other, protecting themselves while they were working.
Yeah, that'd be a guarantee for me to get nothing done well. Trying to do two things at once. I'm a monotasker. I could never be efficient in that area. But yeah, I love that, their enthusiasm. Though they do mimic this behavior where an ounce at the trailhead feels like a pound at the campsite. All their enthusiasm got heavier and heavier and more weighed down with each step toward their goal. And so there's some attitude change for some of them. Without leadership, I think they would have succumbed to that diminishing enthusiasm. And our three big leaders, who had three different areas, provide that clarity of focus and that lift up. And they come from three different backgrounds. Anything else? Any other likes, dislikes? Here's the other thing. What do you not know that you wish you knew more about? That's a question that I constantly ask when I'm thinking about the Bible text. What do I not know? On the first level of the question, I always look and say, okay, do I not know it because I haven't read it in the scriptures yet? And I'll make a note sometimes. I need to make sure I look for this. Let me search this out. Or, the other end, do I not know it because God doesn't tell me? That is both a satisfying and dissatisfying answer. It's satisfying because I actually have an answer, but the curiosity cat that lives inside my head is not satisfied. In this section right here, there's a lot that I don't know and that we don't know. I don't know a whole lot about the worship practice of the displaced Israelites in the capital spaces during this time. I know a little bit. I know this is where the synagogues began in earnest. I know a little bit about latter, Second Temple period, synagogue worship. But somehow, these people maintain their cohesive identity when every ounce ounce around them was trying to make them lose their identity. You know, we feel like sometimes culture is pushing on us to change and to become like everybody else. How many of you are literally in the same kind of pressure cooker that Daniel was in? None of us, right? Not only was he in a leadership role, and there are others underneath him of various backgrounds and circumstances, God is using him to teach us a truth in the most extreme way. But he wasn't the only one. There were others, his buddies, and others who were in captivity. And they figured out how to maintain their cultural, ethnic, and spiritual identity when every power around them wanted them to vanish into history. I would love to know more, like from a practical standpoint, how that accomplished, other than the Bible does actually tell us a few things. We get some hints at this. So that's one area for me I would love to know more. The clock also now says that we've got 40 seconds, so I'm not going to take up any more of that time. But this is a great time if there's any last tidbits that you guys wanted to bring up. You get 36 seconds. Going once, going twice, sold to the value of $0. That's it for class this morning. We'll continue, as I mentioned, with return number 1 next Sunday morning. Thanks, everybody.